What if the reason abundance has remained just outside your reach is not because you lack opportunity, intelligence, or effort, but because your mind has been quietly programmed to expect limitation while you were never paying attention? This question is not meant to provoke emotion. It is meant to pierce illusion, because illusion is the true enemy of success, not circumstance. Napoleon Hill understood this long before neuroscience gave it modern language. He knew that the mind is conditioned long before it is consulted, and that most people spend their lives trying to change results without ever confronting the mental framework producing them. Tonight, as you prepare to surrender consciousness for hours, this is where the real work begins. Sleep is not passive. It is the most active period of mental reorganization you experience each day. While the conscious mind rests, the subconscious consolidates belief, reinforces habit, and strengthens expectation. This is why Hill emphasized autosuggestion so relentlessly, not as repetition of words, but as deliberate programming during moments when resistance is lowest. This is not rest, this is recalibration. Most people fall asleep burdened with unresolved thought, regret from the past, anxiety about the future, silent negotiations with mediocrity. The subconscious absorbs all of it without discrimination. It does not judge truth. It reinforces pattern. And whatever pattern is reinforced becomes tomorrow's behavior, next month's decision, next year's outcome. Abundance is not blocked by the world. It is blocked by expectation. You cannot experience consistently what you do not expect internally. Expectation governs perception. Perception governs action. Action governs result. Hill saw this chain clearly. Break it at the level of thought, and everything downstream reorganizes. As your body begins to relax, understand this. Your current financial, emotional, and personal results are not punishments. They are confirmations. Confirmations of the beliefs you have repeatedly entertained, often unconsciously. This is not condemnation, it is leverage, because what has been learned can be unlearned. What has been programmed can be rewritten. You were not taught how to think, you were taught what to think. About money, about success, about effort, about worth, about what is realistic for someone like you. These ideas were absorbed before you had the authority to question them. Hill called this environmental influence, not an excuse, but a starting point. As sleep approaches, the critical faculty begins to relax. This is the gate. This is where old programming loosens its grip. Tonight is not about dreaming of wealth. It is about removing the internal resistance to receiving it, because resistance is always internal first. Definiteness of purpose is the foundation of abundance, not vague desire, not hope. Definiteness. The mind cannot move powerfully towards something it cannot clearly define. Hill observed that people who struggle financially often speak in generalities. They want more, better, someday. The subconscious does not respond to ambiguity. It responds to precision. But precision requires courage, because to define what you want is to accept responsibility for pursuing it. Many people prefer vague wanting because it protects them from failure. Hill never sympathized with this avoidance. He saw it as self-protection disguised as humility. As your breathing slows, let this truth settle. You cannot attract what you are unwilling to claim. Abundance does not respond to apology. It responds to authorization. The moment you internally authorize yourself to succeed, the mind begins searching for methods instead of excuses. Burning desire is not greed, it is alignment. It is the refusal to live beneath your capacity. Hill understood that abundance flows most freely to those who desire not for escape, but for expression. Expression of ability, expression of service, expression of purpose. Money in his philosophy was never the goal. It was the byproduct of disciplined thought applied consistently. Faith at this stage is not belief in miracles, it is belief in process. The process that disciplined thinking, emotional control, and persistent action must produce results over time. Faith eliminates panic. Panic leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions reinforce scarcity. Hill saw this cycle destroy more potential than lack of talent ever could. Autosuggestion now begins its deeper work, not through loud affirmation, but through quiet assumption. the assumption that abundance is possible, that success is lawful, that effort compounds, that persistence is rewarded. These assumptions, repeated in a relaxed state, begin to replace older ones rooted in fear and limitation. Your subconscious is listening now. It is noting tone, not just words. Certainty impresses it more than enthusiasm. Calm conviction penetrates deeper than excitement. This is why true reprogramming feels quiet, almost uneventful. Drama belongs to resistance, not transformation. Fear of poverty is one of the most deeply ingrained fears in the human mind. Hill identified it as a primary source of self-sabotage. Fear of running out, fear of not being enough, fear of loss. This fear causes people to cling to safety at the cost of growth. It causes them to under-aim, under-commit, and under-earn. But fear cannot survive understanding. Poverty is not a moral condition. It is not destiny. It is not punishment. It is the result of mental habits that can be altered. Hill documented countless individuals who rose from scarcity not by luck, but by changing how they thought, decided, and persisted. Imagination must be reclaimed here, not fantasy but constructive vision. The ability to see yourself operating competently at a higher level, receiving without guilt, earning without apology, managing without fear. This vision must be calm, natural, familiar, because the subconscious resists what feels foreign. As sleep deepens, allow abundance to feel normal rather than exciting. Excitement implies novelty. Normality implies expectation. Hill knew that what you expect consistently, you act toward unconsciously, and unconscious action is the most powerful form of persistence. Decision now becomes central. The decision to stop accepting limitation as truth. The decision to stop repeating inherited beliefs. The decision to take responsibility for your inner economy. Hill emphasized that indecision is the most expensive habit a person can have. It drains energy, invites doubt, and postpones momentum. Self-discipline emerges here as financial clarity. The discipline to think before reacting, to plan before spending, to invest attention intentionally. Abundance is not reckless. It is ordered. It flows toward structure, not chaos. Hill observed that money responds to management, not desperation. Persistence must be anchored here before sleep fully claims you, because abundance is not immediate. It is cumulative. Those who quit early never experience compounding. They judge the process before it matures. Hill warned that impatience is scarcity thinking disguised as urgency. As you drift further, understand this. Your mind is learning a new rhythm tonight, a rhythm of expectation rather than worry, of direction rather than drift, of responsibility rather than blame. These rhythms shape behavior subtly, powerfully over time. The invisible mental forces are active now. Habit is loosening. Expectation is shifting. Identity is adjusting. You do not need to monitor this. Monitoring introduces doubt. Trust introduces continuity. This is the first layer of 13 hours, not designed to overwhelm, but to establish authority. Authority of thought over circumstance. Authority of decision over drift. Authority of discipline over impulse. Rest now in this authority. Let the mind continue absorbing the idea that success and abundance are not external prizes, but internal permissions granted through clarity, persistence, and control. Sleep deeper. The reprogramming has begun. As the hours stretch forward and the body settles more completely into rest, the mind enters a deeper corridor where repetition begins to reshape expectation. This is where the second layer of reprogramming takes hold, not through intensity, but through duration. Napoleon Hill understood that the subconscious is not convinced by single impressions. It is persuaded by consistency. What is repeated calmly without contradiction becomes accepted as reality. In this depth, you are no longer resisting ideas. You are absorbing patterns. The mind is quieter now, less reactive, less defensive. And in this quiet, one of the most dangerous illusions begins to dissolve, the belief that abundance is fragile. Scarcity teaches the mind that resources disappear easily, that security must be guarded anxiously, that loss is always near. Hill recognized this belief as one of the most destructive forms of conditioning because it creates behavior that repels opportunity while trying to protect against loss. Abundance, in contrast, is stable. It is governed by law, not luck. When value is created consistently, reward follows consistently. The mind must be trained to expect continuity instead of interruption. Otherwise, even when abundance arrives, it is mishandled, feared, or unconsciously pushed away. Hill observed that many people do not lose wealth because they lack intelligence, but because their identity has not been conditioned to sustain it. As sleep deepens further, let this truth settle gently. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your self-image. This self-image was not chosen consciously. It was assembled from years of suggestion, observation, and emotional association. Tonight, that image is being quietly adjusted, not inflated, not exaggerated, but stabilized. Stability is the true foundation of wealth. Emotional volatility leads to impulsive decisions. Impulsive decisions lead to inconsistency. Inconsistency disrupts momentum. Hill emphasized that wealth is attracted to those whose emotional states are regulated, whose decisions are measured, whose persistence is steady. Calm minds build durable outcomes. Autosuggestion continues its work now beneath awareness. The subconscious is being instructed indirectly but firmly that success is safe, that responsibility is manageable, that growth does not require chaos. These ideas may feel subtle, almost unnoticeable, but subtlety is how lasting change installs itself. The fear of responsibility dissolves here. Many people secretly fear abundance, not because they doubt their ability to earn, but because they doubt their ability to manage. More money means more decisions, more visibility, more accountability. Hill saw this fear paralyze capable individuals who unconsciously limited their own progress to avoid the perceived weight of success. But responsibility is not weight. It is structure. Structure organizes energy. Without structure, energy dissipates. Abundance flows toward structure because structure can hold it. As this understanding settles, the subconscious relaxes its resistance. Growth no longer feels threatening. It feels orderly. Imagination, now disciplined, begins to constir. UCT scenarios of competence rather than fantasy. You may sense yourself handling larger responsibilities calmly, making decisions without panic, responding instead of reacting. This is not visualization for excitement. This is rehearsal for stability. Hill understood that the mind must feel capable of stewardship before it allows accumulation. Faith deepens into trust here. Trust not in timing, but in alignment. When thought, behavior, and purpose align, results cannot remain stagnant indefinitely. Hill believed stagnation was always a sign of internal contradiction. Once contradiction is resolved, movement resumes naturally. Decision-making sharpens quietly. You are no longer deciding based on fear of loss, but on clarity of direction. Scarcity-based decisions ask, what might I lose? Abundance-based decisions ask, what builds momentum? This shift alone alters financial trajectory over time more than any external strategy. Persistence becomes less dramatic here. It loses its emotional struggle and becomes routine. Routine is powerful because it does not require motivation. Hill observed that those who achieve lasting success do not rely on inspiration. They rely on systems of thought and behavior that operate regardless of mood. Self-discipline integrates fully at this level. Not as restriction, but as alignment between desire and behavior. You begin to sense that discipline is not something imposed on you, but something that frees you from regret, anxiety, and wasted energy. Hill often described discipline as the price of freedom, paid willingly by those who understand its value. Fear of failure fades further into irrelevance. Failure loses its identity as an ending and becomes feedback. Hill insisted that failure only defeats those who interpret it emotionally instead of instructively. The subconscious, now being retrained, begins to associate mistakes with learning rather than shame. This association is critical for persistence. As the hours continue, the mind settles into a new baseline. Less urgency, less noise, less internal pressure. This is not complacency. It is grounded readiness. The kind of readiness that does not rush but does not hesitate. Expectation continues to recalibrate. You begin to expect progress without demanding immediacy, growth without chaos, reward without guilt. These expectations guide attention subtly. Opportunities that once went unnoticed will stand out more clearly. This is not because they suddenly appear, but because the mind is now tuned to recognize them. Hill often spoke of the law of attraction, but not as mysticism, as perception guided by dominant thought. When your dominant thoughts align with abundance, you notice pathways aligned with abundance. When they align with scarcity, you notice obstacles. Attention is selective. Conditioning determines selection. As sleep deepens further into this extended state, the identity of someone who manages resources wisely begins to feel more natural. Someone who plans, someone who delays gratification without resentment, someone who invests effort patiently. This identity does not feel heroic. It feels responsible. Hill knew that responsibility is the gateway to wealth. The invisible mental forces remain active. Habit is restructuring. Emotional associations are shifting. Old patterns of worry are being replaced with patterns of consideration. Consideration is calm. Worry is reactive. One builds, the other erodes. You do not need to force belief here. Belief is forming through exposure and repetition. The subconscious is accepting a new narrative that abundance is built, not chased, that success is lawful, not random, that persistence is more powerful than intensity. This second layer is about stabilization, about teaching the mind that growth does not equal danger, that success does not require sacrifice of peace, that abundance and calm can coexist. Rest here. Let the hours do their work. Let repetition deepen familiarity. Let familiarity become comfort, and let comfort become expectation. The foundation is strengthening quietly. The structure is being prepared to hold more than it ever has before. As the night stretches onward and the body sinks into a stillness so complete it feels as though gravity itself has softened, the mind enters a level of quiet where resistance no longer has strength. This is the threshold Napoleon Hill understood better than most. The threshold where repetition ceases to feel like instruction and begins to feel like truth. At this depth, nothing is argued. Nothing is forced. Ideas are not evaluated. They are absorbed, not as concepts, but as assumptions. And assumptions, more than thoughts, govern destiny. Here, success is no longer something you imagine achieving. It is something the mind begins to organize around without asking permission. Hill taught that the subconscious does not respond to what you want, but to what you accept as inevitable. Wanting is noisy. Inevitability is silent. And silence is where power lives. The sense of self you carried into the night has begun to loosen. Not dramatically, not violently, but subtly, the way ice loosens from the edges of a river before the thaw becomes visible. Labels that once felt permanent no longer feel as solid. Struggler, late bloomer, unlucky, average, overthinker. These identities persist only as long as the mind continues to protect them, and protection requires vigilance. In rest, vigilance fades. Napoleon Hill observed that most people unconsciously defend limitation because limitation feels familiar. Familiarity gives the illusion of control. Even pain feels controllable when it is predictable. This is why people repeat cycles they claim to despise. The subconscious values certainty above comfort, but here, certainty is being redefined. The idea that effort must be accompanied by anxiety begins to dissolve. The belief that progress must feel urgent begins to soften. Hill knew that anxiety is not a sign of importance, but of internal conflict. When desire and belief are aligned, movement feels steady, not frantic. Frantic motion wastes energy. Steady motion compounds it. At this depth, desire transforms again. It is no longer emotional heat. It is direction. It is orientation. Like a current beneath the surface that does not announce itself but never stops moving. You are not chasing success here. You are no longer reaching for it. You are allowing your internal compass to point toward it without resistance. The subconscious begins to accept a powerful premise that you are capable of holding more without breaking. More responsibility, more visibility, more expectation, more opportunity. Hill understood that opportunity often appears before the identity required to sustain it is fully formed. When identity lags behind opportunity, self-sabotage fills the gap. So the mind learns to reject what it cannot yet hold. Here, that gap is closing. Responsibility no longer feels like a threat to peace. It begins to feel like structure. Structure creates predictability. Predictability creates calm. Calm allows expansion. This sequence is rarely understood consciously, but it governs whether growth feels safe or dangerous to the subconscious. Decision-making shifts at this level. Decisions are no longer emotional negotiations. They become expressions of standard. When standards are clear, decisions require little effort. Hill believed that clarity of standard was one of the most underestimated forces in success. Without standards, the mind debates endlessly. Debate drains will. Power. Standards preserve it. Persistence now embeds itself as a natural rhythm rather than a heroic act. You are no longer persisting to prove something. You are persisting because stopping would feel inconsistent with who you are becoming. This is the quiet persistence Hill admired most, the kind that does not burn out because it is not fueled by desperation. Fear continues to lose its emotional charge. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss. These fears survive by attaching themselves to identity. When identity shifts from outcome-based to direction-based, fear loses leverage. Failure no longer threatens who you are. It simply informs how you proceed. Hill often wrote that fear dissolves not through confrontation, but through understanding. Fear exists to protect identity. When identity evolves, fear becomes unnecessary. The mind no longer needs to warn you against expansion because expansion no longer threatens stability. Imagination now works beneath awareness, shaping expectation rather than fantasy. You are not visualizing dramatic victories. You are becoming familiar with competence, familiar with learning curves, familiar with managing pressure without collapse. This familiarity is what allows opportunity to remain present instead of being unconsciously repelled. Self-discipline is no longer framed as denial. It is framed as alignment. You do not resist distractions through force. You simply feel less attracted to them. Hill emphasized that discipline imposed from the outside always fails eventually. Discipline that emerges from identity endures effortlessly. Order becomes comforting. Planning becomes grounding. Consistency becomes reassuring. Chaos begins to feel inefficient rather than exciting. This shift alone separates those who build lasting success from those who experience brief intensity followed by collapse. Expectation continues to recalibrate quietly. You begin to expect progress without drama. You expect obstacles without emotional interpretation. You expect delay without internal panic. These expectations determine emotional response automatically, long before conscious thought intervenes. Time perception changes here. The urgency to arrive disappears. Hill warned that impatience was one of the most destructive traits in ambitious people. Impatience creates shortcuts. Shortcuts undermine foundations. Foundations determine longevity. Patience at this depth is not passive waiting. It is steady action without emotional demand. You act because it is time to act, not because you need reassurance. This form of patience protects energy and preserves clarity. The subconscious continues to reorganize priorities. Attention begins to shift naturally toward usefulness, contribution, and long-term value. Hill taught that wealth follows value with mathematical precision, but the mind must first be oriented toward value creation rather than immediate reward. Money at this level becomes emotionally neutral. It loses its charge as proof of worth or symbol of survival. It becomes a tool, a medium of exchange for value rendered. This neutrality is essential because emotional charge distorts decision-making. The idea of leadership quietly integrates into identity. Not leadership over others necessarily, but leadership over self. Hill believed that self-leadership was the foundation upon which all external leadership rests. Without it, authority collapses under pressure. You may notice now that thoughts arise more slowly. The gaps between them widen. This is not emptiness. This is integration. The mind is consolidating new associations, strengthening new pathways, weakening old reflexes through disuse. Hill emphasized that repetition without contradiction was the most powerful form of mental condition. These hours provide repetition without argument. The conscious mind is resting. The subconscious is listening. Old emotional triggers no longer activate with the same intensity. Situations that once produced anxiety now feel manageable. This is not because the world has changed, but because interpretation has shifted. Interpretation governs emotion. Emotion governs behavior. The identity forming here is quiet, steady, and resilient. It does not seek validation. It does not announce ambition. It does not rush. It builds. This identity is comfortable with responsibility because it trusts itself. Trust is not optimism. It is familiarity with one's own ability to adapt. Hill viewed adaptability as the true measure of intelligence. Mistakes lose their sting. Learning accelerates. Persistence continues without self-criticism. The inner voice becomes neutral, instructional rather than judgmental. Judgment drains energy. Instruction directs it. As the night continues, the subconscious rehearses consistency, showing up without emotional negotiation, acting without needing permission from mood, continuing regardless of external validation. This is where most transformations fail, because this stage lacks excitement. There are no emotional peaks. No dramatic breakthroughs, just quiet realignment. But Hill knew that quiet realignment was the most durable form of change. The mind now accepts a higher internal standard as normal, not exceptional, normal. And what feels normal determines behavior far more reliably than what feels inspiring. You are not becoming someone new here. You are shedding what never belonged. The excess noise, the inherited fears, the borrowed limitations. What remains is steadiness. Rest in this steadiness. Let it deepen. Let the hours continue their work without interference. This layer is not about motivation. It is about normalization. Suck. Abundance and purpose begin to feel less like destinations and more like expressions of alignment. And alignment, once established at this depth, does not require constant effort to maintain. The foundation being set now is strong because it is quiet. It does not depend on mood. It does not depend on circumstance. It depends on identity. And identity, once accepted by the subconscious, becomes destiny. As the night moves deeper and the body remains suspended in that calm heaviness where sleep and awareness overlap, the mind enters a layer where control is no longer exerted through effort, but through command. This is the level Napoleon Hill recognized as mental sovereignty, not motivation, not emotion, authority, the quiet authority of a mind that governs itself without resistance. Here, the subconscious is no longer merely reshaping identity. It is strengthening discipline at its root. Discipline not as punishment, not as restraint, but as command over attention, impulse, and direction. Hill understood that without this internal command, desire scatters, imagination runs wild, and persistence dissolves under pressure. With it, even modest effort compounds into power. At this depth, the mind begins to distinguish between impulse and intention. Impulse is reactive. It seeks relief. It seeks comfort. It seeks distraction. Intention is deliberate. It seeks alignment. It seeks progress. It seeks long-term coherence. Most lives are governed by impulse, not because people lack intention, but because intention has not been reinforced at the subconscious level. Here, that reinforcement is taking place. The inner voice changes tone. It becomes quieter, firmer, less emotional. It no longer asks permission. It issues direction. Hill believed this inner command voice was the defining trait of leaders, whether they led empires or simply mastered their own lives. Without it, the mind negotiates endlessly. With it, action becomes natural. Self-discipline now feels less like effort and more like inevitability. You do what aligns because not doing it would feel inconsistent. Inconsistency begins to feel uncomfortable. This is a crucial reversal. When discipline feels safer than indulgence, behavior stabilizes permanently. The mind starts to release its dependency on external structure. Deadlines, pressure, consequences, praise. These are useful temporarily, but Hill knew they could never replace internal order. External structure collapses under stress. Internal order strengthens under stress. As you rest here, the idea of self-command embeds itself deeper. You are capable of directing your focus without force. You can withdraw attention from what drains you and apply it to what builds you. Attention is currency. Where it flows, energy follows. Hill emphasized that most people go broke mentally long before they go broke financially because they spend attention carelessly. Now, attention begins to organize itself naturally around purpose, not dramatic purpose, practical purpose. What moves you forward? What builds capacity? What creates value? Distractions lose their emotional pull because they no longer promise relief. Relief is no longer required when inner conflict has quieted. Fear mastery continues its work here, but in a different form. Fear is no longer something to be confronted or eliminated. It is something to be managed. Hill taught that fear, like fire, can be destructive or useful depending on containment. At this depth, fear becomes information, not authority. The mind learns to experience fear without obeying it, sensation without reaction, awareness without retreat. This capacity alone separates those who act decisively from those who hesitate endlessly. Hesitation is not caution, it is unresolved internal conflict. Decision becomes sharper now, not faster in a reckless sense, but cleaner. Fewer second guesses, less rumination. Hill insisted that indecision was one of the greatest thieves of opportunity because it dissipates energy without producing action. Decisiveness conserves energy by committing it. Here, the subconscious begins to associate decision with relief rather than threat. Once a decision is made, mental tension drops. This trains the mind to choose rather than delay. Delay prolongs uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds anxiety. Anxiety drains will. Persistence becomes increasingly automatic. You no longer require inspiration to continue. Continuation itself becomes stabilizing. Hill observed that most people wait to feel ready before acting, while successful people act until readiness follows. The concept of time shifts again. You are no longer measuring progress emotionally. You are measuring it structurally. Systems improve. Habits stabilize. Skills compound. These changes are subtle day to day, but irreversible over months and years. Hill trusted compounding more than intensity. Imagination now operates as strategic foresight rather than fantasy. You anticipate obstacles calmly. You see potential setbacks as expected elements of growth. Expectation neutralizes emotional shock. Emotional shock is what derails momentum. Autosuggestion deepens further. The mind repeats to itself not words but assumptions. Assumptions that you continue, that you adapt, that you endure, that you finish what you start. These assumptions require no effort to maintain because they are no longer questioned. The subconscious begins to disengage from the need for approval. Praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes noise. Hill warned that dependence on approval makes discipline impossible because approval is inconsistent. Internal standards are stable. You may sense a growing emotional neutrality here, not numbness, but steadiness. Emotions arise and pass without hijacking behavior. This emotional regulation is not suppression, it is hierarchy. Emotion informs. Intention decides. The mind becomes increasingly intolerant of self-deception. Excuses feel hollow. Rationalizations feel transparent. This is not harshness, it is clarity. Hill believed that self-honesty was a prerequisite for all progress. Without it, effort is misdirected. Responsibility continues to expand comfortably. You no longer avoid complexity. Complexity becomes interesting rather than threatening. Interest directs attention. Attention builds skill. Skill builds confidence. Confidence stabilizes identity. The fear of sustained effort fades. Many fear not work itself, but the idea of unending demand. Here, the mind learns that sustained effort does not feel exhausting when it is ordered and purposeful. Exhaustion comes from resistance, not from work. Rest and action begin to balance naturally. You recover efficiently. You engage fully. There is no guilt attached to rest and no resentment attached to effort. Hill emphasized that balance was not moderation, but rhythm. The invisible mental forces are now operating with precision. Habit loops are restructuring. Old cues no longer trigger old responses. New cues are forming. The mind associates clarity with safety, consistency with peace. You are no longer driven by fear of loss or hunger for validation. You are guided by alignment. Alignment feels stable. Stability invites growth. As the hours continue, the subconscious rehearses leadership over self, making commitments and honoring them. setting direction and following through. This rehearsal happens without imagery, without language. It happens through feeling. The sense of identity now includes authority, not dominance over others, but sovereignty over self. Hill believed this was the rarest and most valuable form of power. You are not forcing discipline. You are becoming disciplined. You are not controlling the mind through tension. You are governing it through order. This layer locks in structure, structure that remains even when motivation fades, structure that carries you forward when circumstances become uncertain. Rest here. Let the command settle. Let the authority integrate fully. The deeper this layer sets, the less effort future success will require. The night continues, and the mind continues to strengthen its grip on itself, quietly, relentlessly, without drama. This is where momentum becomes inevitable. As the night reaches its deepest stretch and the world outside fades almost completely from awareness, the mind enters a state where continuity replaces effort. This is the layer Napoleon Hill understood as the realm of inevitability, where success is no longer pursued, disciplined, or even commanded, but quietly expected. Expectation at this depth does not create urgency. It creates direction. And direction, once set internally, governs behavior with remarkable precision. Here, the subconscious is no longer adjusting beliefs in isolation. It is integrating them into a unified internal system. Desire, faith, imagination, discipline, persistence, and decision are no longer separate forces. They begin to function as one coordinated mechanism. Hill believed that when these elements operate independently, progress is inconsistent. When they synchronize, momentum becomes unavoidable. At this level, the mind no longer seeks reassurance. Reassurance is required only when belief is fragile. Fragile belief needs constant reinforcement. Stable belief operates silently. The inner dialogue grows sparse, not because the mind is empty, but because it no longer needs to negotiate its direction. You may sense now that ambition feels calmer, less dramatic, less emotionally charged. Hill warned against emotional ambition, ambition driven by comparison, fear, or impatience. Emotional ambition burns hot and collapses. Structural ambition endures because it is supported by identity rather than emotion. The subconscious now treats long-term effort as normal. The idea of continuing for months or years no longer triggers resistance. Resistance only appears when the mind believes effort will be chaotic, exhausting, or unrewarded. Here, effort is perceived as ordered, manageable, and meaningful. That perception alone changes everything. Time loses its emotional weight. You are no longer racing against it or fearing its passage. Time becomes a medium through which value is built. Hill emphasized that wealth and success are almost always the result of time applied consistently in one direction. When impatience fades, compounding becomes possible. The sense of self stabilizes further. You no longer identify with temporary states like motivation or mood. You identify with continuity, with showing up, with staying aligned regardless of internal fluctuation. This identity is remarkably resilient because it does not depend on feeling good to function. The fear of monotony dissolves. Many sabotage themselves not because effort is hard, but because repetition feels boring to an untrained mind. Hill understood that mastery is repetitive by nature. Here, repetition becomes reassuring rather than dull. It signals progress rather than stagnation. Imagination now serves foresight with clarity. You anticipate future versions of yourself not with fantasy, but with familiarity. You sense how consistency shapes skill, how skill shapes confidence, how confidence shapes opportunity. These connections feel obvious rather than aspirational. Autosuggestion continues, but now it is nearly invisible. The mind repeats assumptions rather than statements. Assumptions that effort yields results, that persistence is rewarded, that setbacks are temporary. These assumptions require no emotional energy because they are no longer questioned. Faith at this depth becomes grounded trust, not blind belief, not hope, trust built from repeated internal evidence that you continue regardless of difficulty. Hill emphasized that this form of faith was unshakable because it was experiential, not theoretical. The subconscious now expects challenges as part of progress. When challenges appear, they no longer register as disruption. They register as confirmation. This expectation neutralizes frustration before it can form. Frustration wastes energy. Neutrality preserves it. Emotional regulation becomes automatic. Emotions still arise, but they do not linger unnecessarily. They pass through without hijacking attention. Hill believed that emotional control was not suppression, but mastery of interpretation. Interpretation determines duration. Responsibility expands again, but now it feels empowering. You no longer shrink from complexity. You are interested in it. Interest directs learning. Learning builds capability. Capability reinforces confidence. Confidence stabilizes identity. The need to prove dissolves completely here. Proving is a symptom of insecurity. When identity is secure, action is no longer performative. It is purposeful. Hill saw this shift as essential for sustained leadership and influence. The mind grows increasingly intolerant of wasted energy. Drama feels inefficient. Distraction feels hollow. Excuses feel unnecessary. This is not rigidity, it is refinement. The subconscious has learned what supports growth and what drains it. Persistence at this level is effortless, not because effort is absent, but because resistance is gone. You are no longer fighting yourself. Hill wrote that internal conflict was the greatest source of fatigue. Remove the conflict and energy returns. The concept of sacrifice fades. You are not giving something up to move forward. You are choosing alignment over misalignment. Loss is reframed as pruning rather than deprivation. Pruning strengthens growth. Money and abundance now occupy a quiet, stable place in the mind. They are no longer emotional objectives. They are byproducts of usefulness, organization, and persistence. Hill emphasized that when money is placed at the center, judgment becomes distorted. When value is placed at the center, money follows naturally. The subconscious begins to organize behavior around contribution. Not altruism for approval, but usefulness as a principle. Usefulness creates relevance. Relevance creates demand. Demand creates opportunity. This chain feels logical and calm at this depth. The inner world becomes increasingly orderly. Thoughts align, priorities clarify, distractions fade without resistance. This order does not feel restrictive, it feels liberating. Hill believed that freedom was found not in limitless choice, but in clarity of direction. Sleep continues to deepen, but awareness remains steady beneath it. This is where long-term reprogramming becomes permanent. The mind is not learning new ideas. It is stabilizing new defaults. You are no longer preparing for success. You are living in accordance with it internally. External results will follow in their own time without force. The fear of loss loses meaning. Loss is no longer interpreted as personal failure. It becomes part of adjustment. Adjustment is expected. Adaptation is trusted. Hill emphasized adaptability as the highest form of intelligence. The subconscious now rehearses endurance. Not dramatic endurance, but quiet continuation through uncertainty. You remain aligned even when outcomes are unclear. This ability separates those who finish from those who abandon their path prematurely. Approval and disapproval fade further into irrelevance. Internal standards dominate behavior. These standards are not harsh. They are consistent. Consistency creates trust. Trust creates stability. The mind now experiences effort as self-expression rather than obligation. You act not because you must, but because it aligns with who you are. Identity and behavior move in the same direction. As the hours stretch on, this integration deepens. There is nothing to do, nothing to correct, nothing to accelerate. The process unfolds at its own pace, which is precisely the pace required for permanence. This layer is about inevitability, not arrogance, not entitlement. Inevitability built on alignment, structure, and consistency. Hill believed that when inner conditions are correct, outer results cannot be permanently denied. Rest in this inevitability. Let it settle into the subconscious without interruption. This is where long-term success becomes ordinary. The night continues its work and the mind continues to stabilize its direction, quietly preparing for sustained growth that no longer requires conscious force. What has been integrated here will not disappear when the day returns. It will remain, guiding behavior subtly, consistently, and powerfully long after sleep has passed. As the final hours of the night unfold and the mind reaches the deepest layer of stillness, something decisive occurs. This is not the softness of sleep alone. This is the silence that follows integration, the point at which the subconscious stops reshaping and begins to stand guard over what has been installed. Napoleon Hill understood this moment as the crossing point between influence and ownership. What enters the mind here does not visit. It stays. At this depth, the question is no longer which, you might become. The question is whether you will accept the responsibility of who you already are becoming. Because transformation, when it reaches this level, demands ownership. It demands decision, not emotional decision, final decision. Here, the mind recognizes a truth most never confront, that your life has always been governed by internal law, not circumstance. Circumstances merely respond. Hill spent his life observing this pattern across the wealthy and the defeated, the powerful and the powerless. The difference was never intelligence, luck, or opportunity. It was the degree to which a person assumed command of their inner world. The subconscious now understands that there is no neutral state. You are either directing your mind or it is being directed by habit, fear, and environment. There is no pause. There is no waiting period. Every day reinforces either intention or drift, and drift, unchecked, always leads downward. At this level, excuses lose all credibility, not because they are judged, but because they are seen clearly for what they are, attempts to avoid responsibility without escaping consequence. Hill warned that excuses are the most expensive luxury a person can afford because they cost nothing immediately and destroy everything eventually. The mind no longer seeks comfort in explanation. Explanation does not build results. Action does. Alignment does. Persistence does. Comfort has served its purpose. It has protected you long enough. Now it must step aside. You are no longer dealing with ideas here. You are dealing with law, mental law. The law that whatever you consistently think, feel, and act upon becomes your reality with mathematical precision. The law that indecision breeds weakness. The law that persistence neutralizes resistance. The law that faith, once internalized, bends circumstance quietly but relentlessly. The subconscio. Us now accepts a hard truth Hill emphasized repeatedly, that no one is coming, no rescue arrives, no external force will grant permission, clarity, or readiness. Readiness is a decision, not a condition. The illusion of someday dissolves here. Someday is a sedative. It numbs urgency while preserving guilt. Hill knew that people who live in someday remain forever incomplete. Power exists only in now, expressed through decisive action. The mind begins to feel the weight of choice, not as pressure, but as authority. You can continue as you were, reinforcing familiar patterns and predictable outcomes. Or you can act in accordance with the identity that has been forming quietly beneath the surface. There is no middle path that leads anywhere meaningful. Fear makes one final attempt here, not through panic, but through subtle doubt. The doubt that asks whether this alignment will last, whether discipline will fade, whether old habits will return. Hill addressed this directly. Habits return only when standards collapse, and standards collapse only when responsibility is abandoned. Responsibility is no longer optional. It is not something you take on when convenient. It is the price of self-respect. Hill believed that self-respect was the true foundation of confidence, and confidence was the foundation of all success. At this depth, you are confronted with the realization that your inner world has been shaped long enough by default, by inheritance, by reaction, by fear. That era is over now, whether you consciously acknowledge it or not. Awareness has changed the terms. The mind understands now that success is not dramatic, it is repetitive, it is structured. It is often boring to the undisciplined and deeply satisfying to the aligned. It demands consistency when motivation fades. It demands clarity when emotion fluctuates. You are no longer asked whether you believe I. In these principles, belief is irrelevant now. What matters is whether you will live as though they are true. Hill taught that belief without action is self-deception. The final integration occurs here. Purpose and responsibility fuse. Purpose without responsibility is fantasy. Responsibility without purpose is burden. Together they create meaning. Meaning sustains effort when results are delayed. The subconscious now expects you to act differently when you wake. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but decisively, with fewer negotiations, with higher standards, with less tolerance for distraction, excuse, and delay. You will notice that certain behaviors no longer feel compatible. Certain conversations, certain habits, certain compromises. This is not loss. This is alignment asserting itself. Hill warned that when alignment emerges, the world often resists, not because it is hostile, but because it is accustomed to the old version of you. Expect this resistance. Do not interpret it as a sign to retreat. Interpret it as confirmation. You are now standing at the edge of something irreversible, not success itself, but the discipline that makes success unavoidable. This discipline will not announce itself. It will show itself through action taken when no one is watching. The final hours of this reprogramming are not gentle. They are resolute. They remove the last illusion that understanding alone is enough. Understanding is preparation. Action is proof. So now, as the night prepares to release you back into the world, the responsibility transfers fully to you. Decide that your mind will no longer be a battleground of conflicting impulses, but a command center governed by intention. Decide that persistence is no longer optional, but automatic. Decide that fear will be acknowledged, not obeyed. Decide that distraction will no longer dictate direction. Decide that you will act in alignment with your purpose, whether conditions are perfect or not. Decide that you will pay the price of discipline now, rather than the far greater price of regret later. Decide that you will accept full responsibility for your outcomes, knowing that this responsibility is not a burden, but the source of your power. Hill wrote that the moment of decision is the moment destiny begins to reorganize, not because the world changes instantly, but because you do. This is that moment. When you wake, do not wait to feel ready. Act as the person who has already decided. When resistance appears, do not negotiate with it. Continue. When doubt whispers, do not argue. Move forward anyway. When fatigue arrives, rest with intention, then resume. When opportunity appears, step into it without apology. And when fear tells you to retreat into what is familiar, remember that familiarity has already given you everything it ever will. This is the line. Step over it. Commit fully. Assume command of your mind, your habits, your decisions, and your direction. No more partial effort, no more borrowed beliefs, no more delayed action. From this point forward, you are responsible, and that responsibility is the greatest power you will ever possess.